There is a restaurant in the middle of an underwater town that has been condemned, quarantined, infested, and investigated more times than almost any building in television history, and it has never once been permanently shut down. People order food from it every single day. Children eat there, families celebrate birthdays there, and almost nobody in that town seems to notice that the building itself has a documented history that would make any real health inspector quit on the spot. Tonight we are going inside the Krusty Krab, the most popular restaurant in Bikini Bottom, and we are going to walk through every recorded violation, every cover-up, every infestation, and every moment an inspector should have closed the doors for good and somehow did not. We are starting from the very beginning, from the day the restaurant first opened its doors, because the pattern we are about to spend the next 2 hours on did not appear gradually. It was there from day one. Welcome to Cartoonology. Let's get started. The restaurant that should never have opened. Before there was a Krusty Krab, there was a retirement home. The building that now serves thousands of customers a day in Bikini Bottom did not start its life as a restaurant at all. It began as the Rusty Krab, a retirement home that had fallen into disrepair before Mr. Krabs acquired it and converted it into the fast food establishment that exists today. This usually gets treated as a throwaway joke, a little wink about the name, but it is worth sitting with for a moment because it tells you something important about the foundation this entire restaurant was built on. A retirement home is not built for high-volume food preparation. It is not built for industrial grills, deep fryers, grease trap, or the kind of constant foot traffic the most popular item in town would generate. When Mr. Krabs took over that building, he was not starting from a blank slate engineered for food service. He was repurposing a structure built for an entirely different function, and then running one of the busiest kitchens in Bikini Bottom out of it. This matters because almost everything we are going to look at across this video traces back to a single root cause. The Krusty Krab was never built to code in the way a restaurant should be. It became a restaurant because Mr. Krabs needed it to be one, and the conversion happened in the way that conversion always happens when the person doing it cares more about opening day than about the structure underneath. The grill placement, the grease trap, the freezer, the storage areas, all of it exists inside a building that was repurposed rather than designed. And from the very first episode of the series, the show makes it clear that this repurposing did not come with the kind of oversight a new food establishment would normally require. The episode that introduces all of this is called Help Wanted, and it is the very first episode of SpongeBob SquarePants ever aired. On the surface, it is a simple story. SpongeBob applies for a job as a fry cook at the Krusty Krab. Mr. Krabs and Squidward do not think he is a serious candidate, so to get rid of him, they send him on a fool's errand, asking him to find something called a hydrodynamic spatula, an item that does not exist. While SpongeBob is gone looking for this imaginary tool, something happens inside the restaurant that, if you step back and actually look at it, is the first documented health and safety incident in the entire history of the Krusty Krab. The restaurant is invaded by a swarm of anchovies. According to descriptions of the episode, these anchovies do not simply wander in and cause minor inconvenience. They tear down support beams inside the building. They rip down the galley grub sign. They pull down the order up sign in the kitchen. In other words, within the very first episode of the show, before SpongeBob has even been hired, the physical structure of the restaurant is being damaged by a pest invasion severe enough to bring down parts of the interior. This is not a stray fly landing on a counter. This is structural damage caused by an uncontrolled infestation happening inside a working kitchen, while customers are presumably either inside or trying to get inside. Think about what this means if you imagine it happening in a real restaurant. A swarm of any kind of pest entering a food establishment and causing physical damage to support beams and signage would, in any jurisdiction with functioning health code enforcement, be an automatic closure. The restaurant would be shut immediately, not just for cleaning, but for a structural inspection, because beams coming down inside a kitchen is not a sanitation issue anymore. It is a building safety issue. And yet in the world of the show, this entire event resolves itself within the runtime of an 11-minute episode. SpongeBob returns with the spatula he was sent to find, which does not actually exist, but he improvises and the anchovies are dealt with, and by the end of the episode, the Krusty Krab is back in business as though nothing happened. There is no inspection, there is no closure, there is no mention of anyone calling anyone about the damage to the building. The show moves on, and so does the restaurant, and so does everyone who eats there. This is the precedent that gets set in episode 1, and once you notice it, you start to see it everywhere. The Krusty Krab does not operate the way restaurants operate in a world with functioning oversight. It operates the way a restaurant operates in a world where the only thing that matters is whether the doors are open the next day and whether money is coming in. What makes this especially worth examining is that the show never frames this as unusual. Nobody in Help Wanted reacts to the anchovy invasion as a crisis that threatens the restaurant's ability to operate. Mr. Krabs does not panic about lost revenue from a forced closure because there is no forced closure to panic about. Squidward does not complain about unsafe working conditions, even though he was presumably inside the building while support beams were coming going down. The entire event is treated as a kind of background chaos, the sort of thing that simply happens at the Krusty Krab, the same way weather happens. And once a show establishes in its very first episode that structural damage from a pest invasion is just background chaos rather than a closure-level event, it has quietly set the rules for everything that follows. This sets up something important for understanding every other episode we are going to cover. The Krusty Krab is not a restaurant that occasionally has a bad day. It is a restaurant that exists in a kind of permanent state of low-grade disaster, where things that would end most real establishments are simply absorbed into the daily rhythm of the place. The anchovy invasion in Help Wanted is not an outlier. It is the template. It establishes that this building, repurposed from a retirement home, staffed by an owner who cares primarily about money, can experience structural damage and pest invasion within its first day of operation, as shown to the audience, and the consequence is nothing. The doors stay open, the patties keep cooking, the customers keep coming. There is also something worth noting about the building itself that becomes relevant later. Because the Krusty Krab was converted rather than built, certain features of a normal restaurant kitchen are either missing, improvised, or hidden in places they should not be. As we move through this video, we are going to look at a grease trap that nobody seems to have been maintaining, a freezer that gets used as a holding cell for human-sized customers and employees on multiple occasions, and kitchen equipment that produces things that genuinely should not be produced by kitchen equipment. All of these details connect back to the same starting point. This building was not designed to be a restaurant. It became one because Mr. Krabs needed it to be one, and from the very first episode, the show tells us exactly how loosely that transition happened. It is also worth pointing out who works inside this building, because the people inside it are going to matter a great deal as this video continues. SpongeBob, at the start of Help Wanted, is not yet an employee. He is a hopeful applicant, eager and enthusiastic, walking into a building that has just had its support beams torn apart by an anchovy swarm, with no idea that this is the environment he is about to spend the rest of his working life in. Squidward is already there, already unhappy, already treating the chaos around him with the kind of weary resignation that suggests this is not his first encounter with something going wrong inside these walls. And Mr. Krabs is there too, more concerned with whether the restaurant can reopen than with what just happened to it. These three characters and the relationships between them are going to come up again and again across this video, because almost every violation we look at involves them in some combination. SpongeBob is usually the one closest to the actual hazard, often the one who ends up inside the grease trap, inside the freezer, or holding the contaminated food. Squidward is usually the one complaining the loudest while doing the least to actually fix anything, which in its own way reflects how little power any employee at this restaurant actually has. And Mr. Krabs is almost always the one making the decision that turns a manageable problem into a documented violation, because the decision that protects his money is never the decision that protects his restaurant, his employees, or his customers. By the end of Help Wanted, the Krusty Krab has survived its first recorded structural and pest-related incident with 0 consequences, 0 inspections, and 0 changes to how the restaurant operates going forward. This is the foundation everything else in this video is built on. Before we move into the more famous and more dramatic violations, the ones involving actual health inspectors and actual contaminated food, it was important to establish that the Krusty Krab's relationship with health and safety standards was broken from day one, embedded in the very structure of the building and the very first episode of the show. What happens next, starting with an episode that involves a real inspector and a piece of food that should never have existed, takes this foundation and escalates it into something far more serious. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The anchovy invasion in the very first episode showed us that the Krusty Krab could survive structural damage with no consequences at all. But that was an accident, something that happened to the restaurant rather than something the restaurant did on purpose. The next episode we are looking at is different, because this time, the violation is not an accident. It is a decision made deliberately by 2 people who knew exactly what they were doing. Section 2. The Nasty Patty and the Day 2 employees tried to hide a body. Some violations happen by accident. Others happen because 2 people sit down, think carefully about what they are doing, and choose to do it anyway. What happens in the episode called Nasty Patty is firmly the second kind, and it is, without question, the single most serious documented incident in the entire history of the Krusty Krab. This is the episode where a health inspector arrives for a routine inspection, and by the end of it, the owner of the restaurant and his only fry cook believe they have killed him, and they respond to that belief not by calling for help, but by trying to bury the body in the ground behind the restaurant. Before we get into what happens, it helps to understand the setup, because the setup tells you a lot about how the Krusty Krab actually views health inspections in general. The episode opens on what is described as a bright sunny morning at the Krusty Krab. SpongeBob is in the kitchen cooking, and Mr. Krabs is, according to the source material, taking what is referred to as a money bath, sitting in a pile of his own cash. This image alone tells you something about priorities before any anything has even gone wrong. While Mr. Krabs is literally bathing in money, a car pulls up outside the restaurant. The camera zooms in on a badge. The badge reads Health Inspector. The moment Mr. Krabs realizes what is happening, his reaction is immediate and telling. He does not calmly prepare for a routine visit the way an owner who runs a clean operation might. Instead, he panics. He runs to SpongeBob and starts shouting instructions, telling him to wash his hands, clean the floors, and even change his underwear because the health inspector is here. He tells SpongeBob that if the inspector finds even one health violation, he will close the restaurant down for good. This single line is worth pausing on because it is essentially an admission spoken by the owner himself that the Krusty Krab cannot survive a real inspection. Not that it might struggle, not that there might be a few small issues to fix. Mr. Krabs says, in plain terms, that one violation found by this inspector means the end of the restaurant. That is not the reaction of someone who runs a kitchen in good standing. That is the reaction of someone who knows, deep down, that the kitchen is not in good standing, and that an honest inspection would end everything. SpongeBob, in his usual way, tries to reassure his boss. He tells Mr. Krabs there is no reason to worry, because in his eyes, the Krusty Krab is, in his words, the most perfect place in the universe. Mr. Krabs' response to this optimism is to call SpongeBob brainless and push him out the door toward the inspector, telling him to pour on the charm and give the inspector whatever he wants. So from the very opening minutes of this episode, the relationship between the restaurant and the concept of a health inspection is established as adversarial. The inspector is not a partner helping the restaurant meet a standard. The inspector is a threat to be managed, charmed, and gotten rid of as quickly as possible. The health inspector then makes a request that, on its own, is not unreasonable. He asks to be brought one of everything on the menu, which is a standard way for an inspector to sample the food being served to the public and check its quality and preparation. SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs comply with this request, preparing a full spread for the inspector to evaluate. Up to this point, despite all the panic, nothing has actually gone wrong. The inspector is doing his job, and the restaurant, however nervously, is cooperating. Then a television broadcast changes everything. While the inspector is working through the food in front of him, a news report comes on, and it announces that there is a man going around impersonating a health inspector in order to scam restaurants out of free food. This is the turning point of the entire episode, and it is worth being precise about what happens next, because the decision that follows is the actual violation at the heart of this story. Mr. Krabs hears this report and immediately decides, without any verification, that the inspector currently sitting in his restaurant must be this imposter. There is no attempt to check identification. There is no attempt to call anyone to confirm. Mr. Krabs simply decides that because a fraudulent inspector exists somewhere in the world, the specific inspector currently inside his restaurant must be that fraud, purely because the timing is suspicious and because Mr. Krabs is furious at the idea of having given away free food to a con artist. This is the moment where the episode stops being about an inspection gone wrong and starts being about a deliberate act of retaliation against a man who, as the episode later confirms, was a completely legitimate inspector the entire time. Mr. Krabs decides he wants revenge, and he enlists SpongeBob to help him build what the episode calls a nasty patty. This is where the details matter, because this is not a vague gesture toward bad food. According to the source material describing the episode, the nasty patty is constructed using volcano hot sauce, seahorse radish, and toenail clippings. It is then dropped into a toilet. After being removed from the toilet, it is dried using one of Mr. Krabs' own gym socks. Each one of these steps is a separate, deliberate act of contamination, carried out by the restaurant's owner and its fry cook, working together, with the explicit intention of serving this item to a customer they believe deserves to be punished. It is worth sitting with how many individual decisions this required. Someone had to source toenail clippings. Someone had to identify a gym sock as the appropriate drying tool. Someone had to physically carry a piece of food, intended for human consumption, into a bathroom and submerge it in a toilet. None of this happened by accident. None of this happened because of a broken piece of equipment or an unmaintained grease trap. This was an assembly process, step by step, executed with full awareness of what each ingredient was and where it had been by the two people responsible for running the kitchen and serving the public. SpongeBob then carries this item out to the man he and Mr. Krabs believe is a fraudulent inspector and presents it to him. The man, who is in fact the real health inspector and has done nothing wrong at any point in this entire sequence, is about to eat the nasty patty when a fly flies into his mouth. The fly causes him to choke, and in choking, he falls, hits his head on a table, and is knocked unconscious. From the kitchen, watching this unfold, SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs witness the inspector collapse, and they immediately conclude that the nasty patty has killed him. This is the moment where the episode shifts from being about a food safety violation to being about something that, in any real-world context, would be a criminal matter. SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs believe they have killed a man. Their response to this belief is not to call for medical help. It is not to check whether he is actually breathing. According to the source material, the two of them begin arguing and blaming each other for what happened, and then Mr. Krabs makes the decision that the body needs to be removed from the restaurant and and buried. SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs drag the unconscious inspector's body out of the Krusty Krab to a secluded spot, and SpongeBob begins digging a hole. While SpongeBob is digging, the inspector, who is not dead, begins to wake up. In response, SpongeBob throws a rock behind himself without looking, which strikes the inspector and knocks him unconscious again. This happens more than once across the sequence. The inspector regains consciousness and is knocked out again multiple times by two people who are actively in the process of trying to bury him. At this point, two police officers arrive on the scene and offer Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob a ride. This is where the episode adds another layer to the cover-up. Heavy rain has begun washing the inspector's body down the hill toward where the police are standing. SpongeBob, in a panic, stuffs the inspector's body into the trunk of the police car before the officers can notice it. Later, back at the Krusty Krab, when the police are inside the restaurant, SpongeBob hides the inspector's body inside his own hat in order to sneak it past the officers, and then drags the body into the restaurant's freezer. The freezer becomes the final resting place, so to speak, for this entire sequence, and it is worth noting how often the freezer at the Krusty Krab comes up across the show as a place where things and people end up that should not be there. In this episode, it becomes the hiding place for a body that SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs believe to be deceased, a body that belongs to a man who arrived that morning to perform a routine, lawful inspection of the restaurant's food safety standards. The resolution of the episode comes when the police, who are now inside the Krusty Krab on an unrelated matter involving a separate report about two people burying a body, go to the freezer because one of the officers wants ice. When the freezer opens, the inspector, who is alive the entire time, emerges from inside it, groggy and disoriented from being knocked unconscious repeatedly. The police, seeing a figure stumble out of a freezer where a body was supposedly hidden, mistake him for some kind of reanimated corpse and attack him on sight. By the end of the episode, the truth comes out. The man was always the real inspector. The imposter reported on the news had already been arrested elsewhere, which the episode reveals through a second news broadcast showing a photograph of a completely different individual. SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs spent the entire episode contaminating food, serving it with intent to harm, believing they had killed someone, attempting to bury a body, hiding that body inside a police vehicle, hiding it again inside a hat, and storing it inside the restaurant's food storage freezer, all based on a case of mistaken identity that could have been resolved by simply asking the man for identification at any point. What makes this episode so important to this entire video is that it removes any ambiguity about intent. Every other incident we look at across this video involves some degree of negligence, poor maintenance, unfortunate circumstance, or characters reacting badly to something that happened to them. Nasty Patty is different. Nasty Patty is the one episode where the violation is the entire point of the story. The contamination is not a byproduct of a messy kitchen. It is the plan. Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob set out, with full knowledge and full intention, to serve a customer a piece of food that had been deliberately poisoned with hot sauce, contaminated with toenail clippings, submerged in a toilet, and dried with a gym sock, because they believed that customer had wronged them. And the target of this plan was, at every single point, a legitimate health inspector, doing the exact job that exists to prevent this kind of thing from happening to the public. The episode essentially shows us what the Krusty Krab's owner and staff are capable of doing to the one person whose entire job is to catch them doing things like this. If this is how the restaurant treats an inspector it mistakenly believes is a fraud, it raises an uncomfortable question about how the restaurant might treat an inspector it knows is real. A question that becomes very relevant as this video continues into later episodes involving actual, confirmed inspections. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Nasty Patty showed what happens when the Krusty Krab's owner deliberately targets a health inspector. The next episode shows something different, a moment when the consequences of years of neglect finally catch up with the restaurant on their own, with no scheming involved, just a piece of equipment nobody had bothered to maintain. Section 3. Grease trap failure and the shutdown of two restaurants. This one is not an accident, and it is not a deliberate scheme. It is what happens when a piece of equipment that should have been maintained for years finally reaches the point where it cannot be ignored any longer, and the consequences land all at once. And this time they do not stay contained to the Krusty Krab. They reach across the street and pull in its rival as well. The episode in question is called Greasy Buffoons, and it opens with something small. SpongeBob is doing his normal routine, cooking Krabby Patties for customers, when he slips on a puddle of grease on the kitchen floor. According to descriptions of the episode, this moment is actually obscured during the original broadcast because a network banner covering the bottom of the screen hid the grease puddle from view, leaving some viewers confused about why SpongeBob suddenly fell. That detail matters less for the plot and more for what it represents. A grease puddle on a kitchen floor in a real restaurant is exactly the kind of hazard that health and safety inspections exist to catch. It is a slip hazard for staff, and it is a sign of a larger problem with how grease is being contained and disposed of in the kitchen. That larger problem becomes the entire focus of the episode. SpongeBob, investigating where this grease is coming from, discovers something underneath the Krusty Krab that the show frames almost like an archaeological find. He finds the restaurant's grease trap, and it is not in good condition. A grease trap, in any real kitchen, is a piece of equipment with one job. It catches the fat, oil, and grease that comes off food during cooking before that grease can enter the plumbing system or build up somewhere it shouldn't. A grease trap that is being properly maintained is emptied on a regular schedule because grease that is allowed to sit and accumulate becomes a fire hazard, a pest attractant, and, as this episode demonstrates, eventually a problem that physically overflows into the space around it. The amount of grease that SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs find underneath the restaurant suggests this trap has not been emptied in a very long time. There is enough of it that, once they decide to deal with it, the solution requires renting equipment. According to descriptions of the episode, SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs spend the night emptying the grease trap using a hose connected to a containment truck. Think about the scale that implies. This is not a 5-minute task with a bucket and a mop. This is a job that requires industrial equipment run overnight to remove a backlog of waste grease that has been building up under a working kitchen for an unspecified but clearly substantial period of time. The fact that Mr. Krabs is willing to spend money renting this equipment is itself notable, because across the show, Mr. Krabs spending money on anything related to maintenance or safety is rare. The reasoning given in descriptions of the episode is that Mr. Krabs is weighing the cost of renting the truck against the cost of being sued by the health inspector for failing to maintain the trap. In other words, the only reason any of this maintenance happens at all is the threat of legal and regulatory consequences, not any internal standard about how a kitchen producing food for the public should be run. The grease trap was not emptied because it was the right thing to do on a schedule. It was emptied because it had become impossible to ignore, and because the alternative was a lawsuit. This is where the episode takes a turn that elevates it from a single restaurant's maintenance failure into something that affects the entire town. Once SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs have all this grease loaded into a truck, Mr. Krabs makes a decision about what to do with it. Rather than disposing of it properly, he has the grease dumped near the Chum Bucket, the restaurant owned by his rival Plankton. The reasoning behind this, according to descriptions of the episode, is framed as a kind of petty grudge, dumping the Krusty Krab's waste problem onto the doorstep of a competitor, rather than dealing with it responsibly. What happens next is where the consequences stop being contained to one restaurant. Plankton discovers this dumped grease, and instead of being angry about it, he tastes it, and he discovers that it has an appealing flavor. From this discovery, Plankton gets an idea. He begins incorporating this leftover grease into new menu items at the Chum Bucket, and these items prove popular with customers. Mr. Krabs, seeing Plankton's restaurant suddenly succeeding with new grease-based items, responds by doing the same thing at the Krusty Krab, adding his own grease-heavy items to the menu in direct competition. What follows is described in source material as an escalating competition between the two restaurants, with Mr. Krabs and Plankton each trying to outdo the other by putting more and more grease into the food they are serving to the public. Customers at both restaurants are eating these new items and enjoying them, with no idea that what they are eating is fundamentally waste product that originated from an unmaintained grease trap underneath the Krusty Krab. This is the point where the violation stops being about one restaurant's neglected equipment and becomes about two restaurants knowingly serving reclaimed waste grease to an unsuspecting public, marketed as a desirable new menu option. SpongeBob, throughout this escalating competition, is one of the only characters in the episode who seems to recognize that something is deeply wrong with what is happening. According to source material describing the episode, this is one of the rare instances where SpongeBob generally disagrees with Mr. Krabs rather than going along with him. SpongeBob does not want to participate in feeding people grease, and he tries to do something about it. His solution is to call the health inspector himself. This is significant because it is the only time across the episodes we are looking at in this video where an employee of the Krusty Krab actively initiates an inspection rather than reacting to one that arrives unannounced. SpongeBob, recognizing that the public is being deceived and potentially harmed by what is being served to them, makes the call that brings a health inspector to the scene. The health inspector who arrives in this episode is described as wearing a full white suit with goggles and a breathing mask attached, the kind of protective equipment that itself signals the inspector expects to encounter something hazardous. According to descriptions of the episode, this inspector is dressed in a way that connects him visually to other quarantine and hazard suits seen elsewhere in the show, suggesting this kind of full protective gear is something inspectors in this world have needed before, which is its own quiet acknowledgement that conditions at places like the Krusty Krab have been hazardous enough in the past to warrant this level of protection as standard practice. When SpongeBob tries to tell this inspector directly that Mr. Krabs and Plankton are feeding the public grease, both Mr. Krabs and Plankton attempt to stop him from saying it. They try to silence their own employee in front of the inspector, which is itself a telling detail. Even in this episode, where the outcome eventually goes against both restaurant owners, their first instinct upon an inspector arriving motiving is still to suppress the truth rather than to address the underlying problem. The inspector does eventually find out what has been happening. According to the transcript of the episode, the inspector's reaction upon learning the truth includes a comment that he had noticed a strange smell earlier, but had assumed it might simply be that one of the two owners had not bathed in a while. This detail is worth pausing on because it suggests that the smell of what was being served was strong enough and unusual enough that a trained health inspector noticed it immediately, and his first assumption was personal hygiene rather than food contamination, which says something about how normalized a certain baseline of unpleasantness around these two establishments must already be in this inspector's experience. Once the inspector understands the full picture, Plankton attempts to deflect blame entirely onto Mr. Krabs, pointing out that the original dumping of the grease near the chum bucket was Mr. Krabs' doing. The inspector is not fooled by this attempt to shift responsibility, and the result is that he orders both restaurants closed. According to the transcript, the inspector tells both owners that he will be ordering their restaurants to be shut down until they can, in his words, clean up their act. As he leaves the scene, in what reads almost as a final physical punctuation to the entire situation, the inspector's vehicle splashes grease over both Mr. Krabs and Plankton as he drives away. This is, on paper, the most significant regulatory consequence either restaurant faces across any of the episodes covered in this video. Both restaurants are ordered closed simultaneously by a health inspector, following the discovery that both have been knowingly serving reclaimed waste grease to the public as a menu item. And yet, even here, the resolution undercuts the seriousness of what just happened. According to descriptions of the episode, neither Mr. Krabs nor Plankton actually does the cleanup themselves. Instead, SpongeBob resolves the entire crisis on his own by physically absorbing all of the grease from the area into his own body, becoming visibly larger in the process, and then setting off to dispose of it properly himself. Mr. Krabs wakes up the next day, sees that the grease is gone, and initially assumes the entire ordeal was a dream. SpongeBob has to confirm to him that it was real and that he is the one who cleaned everything up. There is no scene of either restaurant actually undergoing the kind of remediation a closure for serving contaminated food to the public would normally require. There is no reinspection shown. There is no indication that the underlying grease trap problem that started this entire chain of events has been addressed in any lasting way, only that the immediate visible mess has been removed by an employee working alone, with no compensation mentioned for this additional labor. What this episode demonstrates, when you step back from it, is a chain reaction that started with one piece of unmaintained equipment underneath one restaurant and ended with two restaurants serving reclaimed waste as food to an entire town, an inspector ordering both establishments closed, and the actual resolution depending entirely on the unpaid extra effort of a single fry cook who was the only person in the entire story who wanted to do the right thing from the start. The grease trap itself, the original source of the entire problem, is never shown being properly repaired, replaced, or placed on any kind of maintenance schedule. The closure order is the most serious consequence either restaurant faces in any episode in this video, and it still resolves without any structural change to how either kitchen actually operates going forward. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The grease trap incident showed what happens when years of neglected equipment finally surface on their own. The next episode takes things in a very different direction, moving away from food contamination and equipment failure into something the Krusty Krab has never had to deal with before, an actual outbreak inside the restaurant itself. Section 4. Quarantine, contagion, and the clam flu lockdown. An illness has never entered the Krusty Krab before. A grease trap can be emptied on schedule. A deliberate act of contamination can simply not happen. Structural damage from pests can be repaired and the building inspected. But this episode introduces something the restaurant, for all its history of neglect and bad decisions, has never had to face. A disease spreading through the dining room while it is full of people. The way everyone inside reacts to that disease ends up revealing just as much about the building as any of the violations covered so far. The episode is called Quarantined Krab, and before getting into what happens inside it, it is worth understanding something about its production history, because that history is unusual and tells its own story. According to source material, this episode was originally scheduled to air in 2020, but its release was withheld from American television for roughly 2 years. The reason given by a spokesperson for the network was that the episode's plot, which centers on a virus spreading through the restaurant, was considered too sensitive given what was happening in the real world at the time. The episode eventually aired in 2022, making it the final episode of its season to be broadcast, years after it was originally produced. This is worth sitting with for a moment before getting into the episode itself, because it tells us that even the people responsible for releasing this content recognized that an outbreak storyline set inside the Krusty Krab was, at a certain point in time, too close to reality to be comfortable. A fictional restaurant's fictional health crisis was held back because it echoed something the audience watching it was actually living through. That is a strange kind of validation for everything this video has been building toward. The Krusty Krab's problems are not so far removed from real-world food safety concerns that they read as pure fantasy. They are close enough that, for 2 years, one network decided audiences were not ready to laugh at them. With that context in mind, here is what actually happens in the episode. A health inspector arrives at the Krusty Krab, and this time, the issue is not food contamination or equipment failure. The inspector declares that there is a disease, referred to in the episode as the clam flu, spreading through the area, and that someone inside the restaurant at this moment is infected with it. According to source material, the inspector uses some kind of device to make this determination, walking around the restaurant with it before announcing his findings. The reaction inside the restaurant is immediate and chaotic. The characters present, which include SpongeBob, Patrick, Squidward, Mr. Krabs, Pearl, and Mrs. Puff, all begin to panic. The health inspector orders the restaurant placed under quarantine, which means that everyone currently inside is now locked in, unable to leave, with one infected person somewhere among them and no way to identify who that person is. This is where the episode becomes less about a single violation and more about a portrait of how the people who run and frequent the Krusty Krab behave when a real, serious situation arises and there is no clear villain to blame and no scheme to execute. Up to this point in the video, most of what we have covered involves either negligence that built up over time or a deliberate act carried out by one or two characters with a plan. This episode is different because nobody has a plan. Nobody knows who is sick. Nobody knows what to do. And the way each character responds tells you something about their priorities. Mr. Krabs' response is the one that stands out most, and it connects directly back to everything established in earlier sections of this video about how he treats the people around him. According to source material, once the group is locked inside under quarantine, Mr. Krabs suggests that whoever turns out to be carrying the clam flu should be locked inside the restaurant's freezer to contain the illness. This is the same freezer that, in the Nasty Patty episode, was used to hide a body that 2 employees believed to be deceased. Now, in this episode, the freezer is being proposed again, this time not as a hiding place for evidence of a crime, but as a containment cell for a sick member of the group, suggested by the restaurant's owner as a solution to a public health crisis happening under his own roof. Think about what this proposal actually represents. The freezer at the Krusty Krab is food storage. It is the place where ingredients that go into the food served to the public are supposed to be kept cold and safe. And across this video, we have now seen it used within the world of the show as a place to hide an unconscious body and as a proposed quarantine cell for a sick person. At no point does anyone in the episode raise the obvious problem with using a food storage unit as either of these things. The freezer is simply treated as available space, a room that happens to be cold, with no consideration given to what that room's actual function is supposed to be, or what it means for that function if it becomes the place where sick or unconscious people are repeatedly stored. According to additional source material describing the episode, what follows is a sequence in which the characters, trying to figure out who among them might be carrying the illness, end up exposing themselves to some of the least hygienic parts of the restaurant in the process. SpongeBob ends up crawling underneath the restaurant's dirty grill. Squidward gets caught inside the grease trap, the very same piece of equipment whose condition was central to the events of the previous section of this video. Pearl ends up in a situation involving Mr. Krabs and her blowhole. Patrick, in his usual way, ends up using his tongue in a manner that results in him inhaling what is described as dust bunnies. Mrs. Puff ends up covered in trash. What this sequence does, intentionally or not, is take 5 characters who are locked inside a restaurant because of a health crisis and have all 5 of them come into direct physical contact with the dirtiest, least maintained parts of that restaurant's interior. The dirty grill, the grease trap, trash, dust accumulation severe enough to be described in terms of dust bunnies. In trying to escape or resolve the quarantine situation, the characters end up demonstrating, almost as a kind of inadvertent inventory, just how much unclean material exists throughout the building. If a health inspector were cataloging violations during an actual inspection, this sequence reads almost like a checklist of areas that have clearly not been properly cleaned in some time, each one touched by a different character in turn. According to source material, Mr. Krabs ends up suffering the consequences of all of these exposures combined, described as a form of karma for his earlier suggestion to lock someone else in the freezer. By the end of this portion of the episode, the characters who were searching for the source of the illness have, between them, made direct contact with nearly every unhygienic surface and system in the restaurant, and Mr. Krabs in particular ends up affected by the cumulative result of all of it. The episode does not end with a clean resolution in the way you might expect from a story about an outbreak. According to source material, the health inspector returns to the restaurant later, at night, and admits that there was actually no clam flu to begin with. The entire crisis that triggered the quarantine, the lockdown, the panic, the freezer proposal, and the sequence of characters crawling through grease traps and dirty grills was based on a false reading. There was never an infected person inside the restaurant in the first place. However, the episode does not simply let everyone walk away once this is revealed. By this point, after everything the characters have been been through, crawling through grease, grills, trash, and dust. Several of them are now actually sick, for real, as a direct result of what they were exposed to during the false quarantine. The inspector, finding everyone now genuinely ill, places the restaurant under quarantine again, this time for a condition that is real, caused not by any external virus, but by the conditions inside the building itself that the characters were forced into contact with while searching for a threat that never existed. There is something worth pulling out here that connects this episode to the larger pattern of this video. The original health crisis was a false alarm. Nothing about the supposed clam flu was ever real, but the search for that false threat led directly to a real one, because the building itself, independent of any outside virus, contains enough uncleaned and unmaintained material that simply making physical contact with parts of it was enough to make multiple characters sick. The Krusty Krab did not need an outside disease to become a health hazard. It already was one. The clam flu was the excuse that revealed it, but the actual cause of illness by the end of the episode has nothing to do with any virus at all. It is the restaurant. This episode also includes a moment that captures something about how these characters treat each other under pressure, and it connects to themes that have come up throughout this video regarding how blame gets assigned at the Krusty Krab. According to source material, at one point during the panic, Squidward accuses SpongeBob of being the one carrying the clam flu, declaring that SpongeBob belongs in the freezer and should be put there. This is the same freezer Mr. Krabs proposed using earlier. The instinct to identify a scapegoat and lock that person away in cold storage is not unique to Mr. Krabs in this episode. It spreads to Squidward as well, suggesting that this response, treating the freezer as a containment solution for a person, rather than recognizing it as food storage that should never be used this way, is something closer to a shared reflex among the people who work at this restaurant, rather than a quirk belonging to Mr. Krabs alone. By the time the episode ends, the Krusty Krab has gone through two separate quarantines, one based on a false threat and one based on a real illness caused by conditions inside the building itself, and the freezer has been proposed twice as a place to contain sick or suspected individuals. There is no indication in the episode that anything about the building's cleanliness is addressed afterward. The grease trap that Squidward got caught in is the same grease trap discussed in the previous section of this video, the one that required an entire night of industrial cleanup using rented equipment in a separate episode. There is nothing here to suggest that cleanup was lasting, or that the grill, the dust accumulation, or any of the other conditions exposed during this episode's quarantine sequence are addressed once the immediate crisis passes. What this episode adds to the overall picture of the Krusty Krab is the idea that the restaurant does not need an external event to become dangerous. Earlier sections of this video covered a deliberate act of contamination and a buildup of waste grease that eventually had to be dealt with. This episode shows that even when the external trigger turns out to be completely fictional, the building itself is still capable of making the people inside it sick, simply by virtue of what it already contains and how little of it has ever been properly cleaned. The clam flu was never real. The illness the characters end up with by the end of the episode is. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The quarantine episode showed that the Krusty Krab does not need an outside threat to make people sick. The building itself is enough. The next episode shifts focus away from the restaurant's interior and towards something the Krusty Krab sells without ever checking where it actually came from. Section 5, Toxic Beverages and the Kelp Shake Contamination. This time the danger does not come from inside the Krusty Krab at all. It comes from outside, from a competitor that nobody in town bothered to question, and it ends up affecting the entire town, Mr. Krabs included, in a way that exposes how little verification goes into what gets served and swallowed in Bikini Bottom in the first place. The episode is Best Frenemies, and it begins with Mr. Krabs noticing something that, for him, is the only kind of problem that ever truly gets his attention. His profits are down. According to source material, Mr. Krabs is counting his money when he realizes the Krusty Krab's earnings have dropped, and when he asks Squidward what is going on, Squidward tells him that nobody has ordered a drink from the restaurant in days. SpongeBob explains why. Everyone in town, including SpongeBob, Squidward, and Pearl, has started drinking something called a kelp shake, sold by a new restaurant that has opened up across Bikini Bottom. Mr. Krabs' reaction to this is immediate and tells you everything about where his priorities sit. According to source material, Mr. Krabs responds by banning all outside drinks from the Krusty Krab entirely. He does not investigate what this new product actually is. He does not ask any questions about where it comes from, what it is made of, or whether it is safe. His concern is purely that his customers are spending their money somewhere else, and his solution is an outright ban on outside beverages inside his restaurant, a policy that, notably, causes customers to simply leave rather than comply, which actively makes his profit problem worse rather than better. This detail matters because it sets up the central irony of the entire episode. Mr. Krabs' first instinct, faced with a new product he knows nothing about, is not curiosity about its safety. It is concern about his bottom line. The question of whether this new drink that an entire town has suddenly started consuming is actually safe to drink does not even occur to him as a consideration. It only becomes relevant once it directly affects him, and even then, his path toward discovering the truth is driven by financial rivalry rather than any concern for public health. This is where Plankton enters the story. According to source material, Mr. Krabs goes to find out what mood Plankton is in, framing their relationship in this episode as something closer to two business rivals who, for once, share a common problem. The Kelp Shake restaurant is taking customers away from both of them, the Krusty Krab and the Chum Bucket alike. This shared threat is what brings Mr. Krabs and Plankton together to investigate the new product. Not any concern about whether it is harmful, but because it is succeeding where both of their restaurants are currently failing. Before getting any further into the Kelp Shake investigation, it is worth pausing on something this episode reveals almost in passing, something that becomes much more important once you start thinking about it in the context of everything this video has already covered. Mr. Krabs' worry about losing customers to a rival is not new. It is, in fact, one of the most consistent things about him across the entire show, and the Chum Bucket itself provides a long-running example of exactly how unreliable the relationship between a restaurant's success and the actual safety or quality of its food can be in Bikini Bottom. Take, for example, an episode called Chum Bucket Supreme. According to source material, this episode revolves around Plankton's struggle to attract any customers at all, a struggle that has, by this point in the show, repeated itself across multiple episodes. The Chum Bucket's signature product, Chum, is described directly in the source material as something people find awful tasting, something that, when finally consumed, causes customers to immediately vomit it back out into the bucket it was served in. The food itself is not in question here. Everyone agrees it is bad. The customers who eat it know it is bad while they are eating it. And yet, according to the same source material, the Chum Bucket becomes successful anyway. Not because the food improves, not because any safety or quality issue gets addressed, but because Patrick, hired purely by accident as an advertising director, comes up with a slogan. The slogan, described in source material as Chum is Foom, has no real meaning, but it is catchy enough that customers begin lining up to eat the same food they were vomiting moments earlier, simply because repeating the slogan to each other while eating it becomes its own kind of attraction. According to the transcript referenced in source material, customers are shown saying the slogan over and over, specifically as a way of getting through the taste of the food itself. What this demonstrates, when placed alongside the Kelp Shake situation in Best Frenemies, is that the relationship between a restaurant's popularity and the actual condition of what it is serving in Bikini Bottom is, at best, loose. The Chum Bucket's chum does not become safer or more palatable when it becomes popular. It becomes popular because of a slogan, while remaining exactly as unappetizing as it always was, a fact the customers themselves openly acknowledge while continuing to eat it. If a product this widely agreed to be foul can achieve sudden, widespread popularity purely on the strength of marketing, with no actual change to the product itself, then it becomes much easier to understand how something like the Kelp Shake, an entirely new and completely unverified product, could spread across the same town just as quickly, with just as little scrutiny, before anyone discovered what was actually in it. The investigation into the Kelp Shake itself, as described in source material, involves Mr. Krabs and Plankton attempting to steal a sample of the drink. According to source material, this involves both of them queuing up, with Mr. Krabs at one point pretending to cough in order to create a distraction so he can push Plankton toward the kitchen area, where Plankton ends up crashing into a door. Eventually, the two of them manage to obtain a sample, and they bring it back to the Chum Bucket to have it analyzed using Karen, Plankton's computer. The analysis does not get far before Plankton, described in the source material as impatient, interrupts the process. Rather than waiting to find out what is actually in the Kelp Shake through proper analysis, Plankton and Mr. Krabs decide to simply drink it themselves. This is worth pausing on because it is the second time in this single episode that an opportunity for actual investigation into an unknown substance is abandoned in favor of impatience. First, Mr. Krabs bans the drink from his restaurant without finding out what it is. Then, when an actual analysis is underway that could reveal what the drink contains, Plankton cuts it short because he does not want to wait for results. At no point does either character demonstrate the kind of caution that would normally apply before consuming an unidentified substance that an entire town has been drinking. The consequences of this decision arrive almost immediately. According to source material, SpongeBob appears later that day, covered in what is described as greenish-yellow, fur-like kelp. This is the first visible sign that something about the Kelp Shake is seriously wrong, not with one person's individual reaction, but as a widespread effect. SpongeBob reveals that all of the Kelp Shake restaurants across town have been shut down because the product has been determined to be unhealthy. The scale of what follows is where this episode becomes relevant to everything else covered in this video. According to source material, two individuals described as decontaminants arrive and reveal that it will take decades to fully get rid of what is described as the unhealthy toxic waste associated with this product. This This is not a minor recall. This is a description of a substance that an entire town consumed in large quantities over what appears to be a short period of time that is now being classified as toxic waste, requiring a cleanup timeline measured in decades. Shortly after this revelation, Mr. Krabs and Plankton themselves begin developing the same greenish-yellow, fur-like growth that SpongeBob has, meaning that their earlier decision to drink the kelp shake without waiting for analysis has now directly affected them as well. What makes this episode so significant in the context of this video is the question of scale. Every other episode covered so far involves a violation that is largely contained to the Krusty Krab itself, its kitchen, its grease trap, its freezer, its staff, and its immediate customers. This episode describes something that affected the entire town of Bikini Bottom simultaneously. An entire chain of restaurants opened, sold a product to seemingly every resident, and that product turns out to be something requiring decades of decontamination once its true nature is discovered. And the discovery only happens because two restaurant owners, motivated entirely by lost profits rather than any concern for public welfare, decided to investigate a rival rather than because any actual oversight caught the problem before it spread across the entire population. This raises an uncomfortable question that the episode itself never directly addresses, but that becomes impossible to ignore once you consider it alongside everything else in this video, and alongside what we already know about the Chum Bucket from Chum Bucket Supreme. If an entire chain of restaurants serving a product that turns out to be classified as toxic waste was able to open across Bikini Bottom and serve seemingly every resident before anyone identified a problem, and if a separate restaurant in this same town can build a sudden wave of popularity around a product its own customers describe as awful purely through a catchy slogan, what does that say about the standards governing food and beverage safety in this town in general? The Krusty Krab's individual violations, the grease trap, the contaminated patty, the freezer being used as a containment cell, all of those involve one restaurant cutting corners. The kelp shake situation involves an entirely different establishment achieving something far worse at a far larger scale, with apparently no oversight catching it until two business rivals stumbled onto the truth purely because they wanted their customers back. There is also something worth noting about how this connects back to the Krusty Krab's own history with outside products. Source material describing the broader history of the Krusty Krab notes other instances where products from outside the restaurant have ended up being served or consumed there, including instances where customers have paid for and enjoyed food from Plankton's Chum Bucket without realizing what they were actually eating, a pattern reflected directly in the Chum Bucket Supreme episode, where customers keep returning despite knowing exactly what they are eating and exactly how it tastes. The pattern that emerges when you place this episode alongside those other instances is that the people of Bikini Bottom and the restaurant owners serving them generally do not seem to ask very many questions about what they are consuming or what they are serving until something goes wrong on a scale large enough that it can no longer be ignored. By the end of Best Frenemies, the kelp shake situation results in Mr. Krabs and Plankton developing the same contamination as SpongeBob, the kelp shake restaurants being shut down entirely, and a cleanup effort described as taking decades. And yet, according to source material, the episode ends with Mr. Krabs and Plankton, now both covered in the same fur-like growth, simply moving on. Mr. Krabs gives Plankton a Krabby Patty, and then chases him out of what is described as boredom, and the two of them resume their rivalry as though the events of the episode were simply an inconvenience that has now passed, rather than the aftermath of what was, by the episode's own description, a toxic waste situation affecting the entire town. This is perhaps the clearest example in this entire video of a pattern that has been building across every section so far. A serious event occurs. The scale of that event, in this case, a decades-long decontamination process affecting an entire town's population, is acknowledged within the episode itself. And then, by the end of the same episode, life simply continues. There is no follow-up. There is no lasting change to how anyone in Bikini Bottom evaluates new restaurants or products before consuming them. The Krusty Krab does not emerge from this episode with any new caution about outside products, despite its own owner having just been directly affected by exactly that kind of unverified consumption. And the Chum Bucket continues operating exactly as it always has, on the strength of slogans rather than substance. What this episode ultimately demonstrates is that the problems explored in this video are not unique to the Krusty Krab. They are symptomatic of something larger about how food and beverage safety functions, or fails to function, across Bikini Bottom as a whole. The Krusty Krab's grease trap, its freezer, its kitchen conditions, all of these are specific to one restaurant, but the willingness to consume an unidentified product at scale, without question, until the consequences become impossible to ignore, and then to simply move past those consequences once the immediate crisis resolves, is a pattern that extends well beyond the walls of the Krusty Krab itself. The restaurant we have spent most of this video examining did not create this pattern. It simply operates within it, comfortably, as one part of a much larger town-wide tendency to not ask questions until it is too late. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The kelp shake situation showed that the Krusty Krab's problems are part of a much larger pattern across Bikini Bottom. The next episode brings the focus back inside the restaurant's own kitchen, to a night when the equipment itself produced something that should never come out of a working kitchen at all. Section 6. The Kitchen That Builds Monsters. This episode is about what the Krusty Krab's kitchen produces under completely ordinary conditions, with no inspector at the door, no outside product, and no pest invasion to blame. The difference is who is doing the cooking. Not SpongeBob, the one character who has consistently shown some care about doing things properly, but Mr. Krabs himself, preparing food for paying customers with his own two claws, and the result is something that does not stay food for very long. The episode Squilliam Returns begins with a setup that, on its surface, has nothing to do with food safety at all. Squidward's old high school rival, a wealthy octopus named Squilliam Fancyson, returns to Bikini Bottom and begins bragging to Squidward about his successful life. According to source material, Squidward, feeling humiliated by his job as a cashier at a fast food restaurant, lies to Squilliam and tells him that he actually owns a fancy 5-star restaurant. Squilliam, taking this at face value, decides to invite himself and a group of people to have dinner at this restaurant that very night. This lie immediately creates a problem, because the restaurant Squidward actually works at is the Krusty Krab, a fast food establishment that bears no resemblance to the kind of fine dining venue Squidward has just claimed to own. According to source material, Squidward convinces Mr. Krabs to let him run the Krusty Krab for the evening, and Mr. Krabs agrees, largely because Squilliam is described as being wealthy, which is, in the source material's words, music to Mr. Krabs' wallet. Once again, the decision that sets this entire episode in motion is driven by Mr. Krabs' interest in money rather than by any consideration of what is actually happening to his restaurant or his food. What follows is an attempt to transform the Krusty Krab, in a matter of hours, into a 5-star restaurant. According to source material, Squidward attempts this transformation himself at first, and all of his attempts fail. The breakthrough comes when Squidward gives SpongeBob a manual on fine dining and instructs him to empty his mind of everything except fine dining and breathing. SpongeBob takes this instruction with the same literal enthusiasm he brings to everything, and according to source material, this results in SpongeBob performing what is described as a miracle, successfully creating the appearance of a 5-star establishment and even earning a degree of pride from Squidward, who has spent most of his time on the show being unimpressed by SpongeBob. This sets up the central tension of the episode, which is the gap between appearance and reality. On the surface, by the time Squilliam arrives, the Krusty Krab looks like a fine dining establishment, but underneath that surface, in the kitchen, the actual food being prepared has not changed. The people preparing it have not changed. The equipment has not changed. All that has changed is the presentation, the decor, and the level of performance SpongeBob is putting on at the front of house. The kitchen itself remains the same kitchen this entire video has been examining, the one with the unmaintained grease trap, the freezer with its history of containing things it should not contain, and an owner whose primary qualification is not cooking ability but ownership. This is where Mr. Krabs becomes directly relevant to the kitchen side of the operation. According to source material, while SpongeBob is busy performing the role of a fine dining waiter at the front of the restaurant, something is happening in the kitchen that nobody outside of it is aware of. Mr. Krabs, who according to source material was previously employed as a head chef on a vessel referred to as the SS Diarrhea, and who at another point claimed to have been the head chef on the SS Gourmet before admitting that he actually only cleaned the bathrooms on that ship, is the one responsible for preparing food in the kitchen during this transformation. The result of Mr. Krabs' cooking during this sequence is described in source material as an appetizer. The exact nature of this appetizer is described in fragments throughout the source material, including a description of peas that were prepared with their lids still on, and a piece of food that is described as completely warped and mashed up, with something referred to as fly wings as part of it. When Squidward eventually goes to check on what is happening in the kitchen and sees this appetizer for the first time, his reaction, according to the transcript, is to exclaim in shock at what he is looking at, asking what it even is. Mr. Krabs' response is simply to confirm that this is the appetizer he has prepared. What makes this moment worth examining closely is what it represents about the actual food being produced inside this kitchen when nobody from outside is supervising the process. SpongeBob, throughout the episode, is occupied with the performance of fine dining at the front of the restaurant, emptying his mind of everything except etiquette and presentation. He is not in the kitchen overseeing what Mr. Krabs is cooking. Squidward is similarly occupied managing the overall operation and trying to keep the illusion of a 5-star restaurant intact for Squilliam. This means that, for a portion of this episode, the food being prepared for paying customers who believe they are dining at a fine establishment, is being prepared by the one person in this entire video who has repeatedly demonstrated that his decisions are governed by financial interest rather than food safety, working without any oversight at all. The appetizer itself, as described, contains peas that were apparently cooked with their container still sealed, which raises questions about what cooking process was actually applied and whether the contents were ever properly heated or prepared at all. It also contains what is described as fly wings, the presence of insect parts in food being prepared for paying customers, and the overall description of the dish as warped and mashed up suggests something that has not been prepared according to any standard recipe or process, but has simply been assembled or cooked in whatever manner Mr. Krabs happened to apply to it. But the appetizer is not where this sequence ends. According to source material, this dish does not simply sit there as a failed piece of cooking. It is described as coming alive. Mr. Krabs, upon seeing what has happened to his own creation, reacts by shouting for everyone to run, declaring that it is the appetizer, as though the appetizer itself has become a threat that people need to flee from. Source material describes this creature, born from Mr. Krabs' cooking, as something that ends up chasing Mr. Krabs and Patrick, who at this point are tied up in the kitchen as a result of earlier events in the episode involving SpongeBob's transformation process. Think about what this sequence actually represents when placed in the context of everything else in this video. This is not a grease trap that has gone unmaintained for years. This is not a deliberate act of contamination carried out with intent the way the Nasty Patty was. This is food prepared in the Krusty Krab's kitchen by the restaurant's owner using normal kitchen equipment under conditions the episode presents as completely unremarkable for that kitchen that becomes animate. The food itself becomes a living creature capable of chasing people through the building. And the reaction from Mr. Krabs is not shock that this has happened, but a kind of immediate, practiced alarm, as though this is a possibility he is at least somewhat prepared for, even if the specific outcome surprises him. The episode resolves this thread by having the appetizer creature's rampage be one of the factors that ultimately exposes the truth to Squilliam. According to source material, the chaos caused by Mr. Krabs and Patrick being chased by this creature, combined with SpongeBob's mental collapse after being asked his own name, a question his emptied mind cannot answer, results in the entire fine dining illusion collapsing. SpongeBob, having erased his own identity from his mind in order to perform the role of a fine dining waiter, goes into what the source material describes as a state where he goes completely insane, spilling food on patrons and behaving erratically. With the appetizer creature loose, Mr. Krabs and Patrick freed from the kitchen and being chased, and SpongeBob no longer functioning, the facade Squidward built falls apart entirely, and he is forced to admit to Squilliam that the Krusty Krab is not a 5-star restaurant and that he himself is simply a cashier. What this episode adds to the overall picture of the Krusty Krab is something that none of the previous sections have directly addressed. Every other episode involves a violation that exists somewhere in the building, in the equipment, in the storage, in the handling of a specific incident. This episode shows what happens when the actual cooking itself, performed by the restaurant's owner under what the episode presents as ordinary circumstances, produces something that goes beyond contaminated or unsafe food and becomes something that the show itself frames as monstrous. The appetizer is not simply bad food. It is food that, once prepared by Mr. Krabs in this kitchen, stops being food entirely and becomes a separate, hostile entity that the people in the building need to escape from. It is also worth noting what this episode implies about the gap between what customers see and what is actually happening behind the scenes at the Krusty Krab. For the portion of the episode where the fine dining illusion is intact, customers are seated, served, and apparently satisfied with what they believe is a high-quality dining experience. They have no visibility into the kitchen, where Mr. Krabs is producing food that, left unsupervised for even a short period, becomes something that needs to be fled from. The presentation at the front of the restaurant and the reality in the kitchen are, in this episode, almost completely disconnected from one another, and the only thing that prevents the kitchen's reality from reaching the customers is the fact that the appetizer creature happens to be contained within the kitchen itself during the time it is rampaging, rather than escaping out into the dining area where the customers Squilliam brought with him are seated. This episode also reinforces something that has come up repeatedly across this video, regarding who actually keeps the Krusty Krab functioning on any given day. SpongeBob's transformation into a fine dining waiter is what allows the restaurant to present itself as something it is not. Squidward's planning and management is what holds the illusion together for as long as it lasts, and Mr. Krabs, the owner, the person whose name is on the restaurant and whose decisions have driven nearly every violation covered in this video, is the one left alone in the kitchen, and the result of that is food that becomes a living threat to the people around it. When the people who normally compensate for the kitchen's conditions are occupied elsewhere, even for one evening, what comes out of that kitchen is something the episode itself treats as too dangerous to be near. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Squilliam Returns episode showed what the kitchen produces when Mr. Krabs is left alone in it, even for one night. The next section steps back from individual episodes entirely to look at how often this same kind of infestation and contamination has appeared across the show's history, not as a one-time event, but as a a recurring pattern. Section 7. Pest infestations across the years. It is time to stop looking at these as isolated events and start looking at them as a sequence. Every section so far has treated its incident as self-contained. It begins, it escalates, it resolves inside a single episode, and the show moves on as though nothing changed. But take one specific category of disaster, pest infestation, and line it up across the show's entire history, and the separate incidents stop looking separate. What emerges is a pattern, and that pattern says something about the building itself that no single episode, on its own, ever fully captures. The first instance of this pattern, as established earlier in this video, comes from the very first episode, Help Wanted. The anchovy swarm that invades the restaurant before SpongeBob has even been hired, tears down support beams and damages signage inside the kitchen. At the time, this was framed simply as the foundation for everything else. The moment that establishes the Krusty Krab can experience structural damage from a pest invasion and continue operating the next day with no consequences. But what matters for this section is that this is not described anywhere in the show's history as the only time anchovies have been an issue for this restaurant. The very nature of the location, an underwater fast food restaurant serving food made from what are implied to be sea creatures, sitting in open water where other sea creatures live and travel, means that the boundary between the restaurant's interior and the marine environment around it is, by definition, far less secure than the boundary in a land-based restaurant would be. A land-based restaurant has walls, doors, and a clear separation between inside and outside. The Krusty Krab exists inside the same body of water as the creatures that might want to get into it. This is worth sitting with because it reframes the anchovy invasion from Help Wanted not as a one-time freak event, but as something closer to an inevitability given where this restaurant is located. If a swarm of anchovies was able to get inside the building and cause structural damage once, there is no reason within the logic of the show to believe this could not happen again, especially since nothing about the building's structure or its entry points appears to have been modified after that first incident. The show never shows us a scene where Mr. Krabs invests in better sealing for the restaurant or where any kind of pest prevention measure is installed as a result of what happened in the first episode. The building remains exactly as vulnerable as it was on day one. The second major pattern worth examining connects back to the fungal and toxic contamination theme that appeared in the Best Frenemies episode, where the kelp shake situation resulted in characters being covered in what was described as a fur-like greenish-yellow growth that took on the qualities of a spreading contamination. According to source material referencing the broader history of episodes, there is also an episode titled Fungus Among Us, which exists within the same season as Best Frenemies. While the specific plot details of Fungus Among Us were not part of the material gathered for this video, its title alone, combined with its placement in the same season as an episode about a toxic, spreading, fur-like contamination affecting multiple characters, suggests that the show was returning to a similar well of ideas more than once within a relatively short span of episodes. A fungal outbreak and a toxic kelp-based contamination are not the same thing, but they share a common thread, something spreading uncontrollably, affecting multiple characters physically, and originating from a source that nobody properly investigated before it became a problem. What this suggests, when you look at it across the show's run, rather than within a single episode, is that contamination and infestation are not occasional plot devices that the show reaches for once and then moves past. They are recurring structural elements of how stories get told in this world. The show returns to variations on this idea repeatedly, sometimes in the form of a literal pest infestation like the anchovies, sometimes in the form of a spreading physical contamination like the kelp growth, and sometimes in the form of an illness, as covered in the Quarantined Crab episode in an earlier section of this video. Each time, the specific details differ, but the underlying shape of the story is similar. Something gets into a space, usually a space connected to food or to the Krusty Krab specifically. It spreads further than anyone anticipated, and the resolution typically involves either a single character absorbing or removing the problem, as SpongeBob did with the grease in an earlier episode, or the problem simply working itself out off-screen, as happened with much of the kelp shake decontamination. There is also a quieter pattern worth noting, one that does not involve a single dramatic episode, but instead involves the consistent presence of pest-related elements in the visual background of the Krusty Krab across many episodes, even ones not centrally about an infestation. The show is set in an underwater environment populated by countless background creatures, incidental characters, and marine life that exists simply as part of the world. In a real restaurant, the presence of this much uncontrolled wildlife in close proximity to a food preparation area, even wildlife that is not actively swarming or invading, would represent an ongoing pest management challenge that never fully goes away. The anchovy swarm in Help Wanted was a dramatic, plot-driven version of this underlying reality, but the underlying reality itself, an underwater food establishment surrounded on all sides by the kind of creatures that, on land, would be considered pests in a kitchen environment, never goes away between episodes. It is simply not always the focus of the story. This connects back to something raised in the very first section of this video, regarding the building's origins as a converted retirement home, a structure that was not originally designed as a food establishment, repurposed without what appears to be any significant renovation to address pest entry points, sitting in an environment where the line between inside and outside is inherently porous, is a structure that is always going to be vulnerable to this kind of recurring issue. The anchovy invasion in the first episode was not a problem that got solved. It was a problem that got resolved for the purposes of that episode's plot, while the underlying conditions that made it possible remained completely unchanged. It is also worth considering how the staff and ownership of the Krusty Krab respond to this pattern, or rather, how they do not respond to it. Across every instance covered in this video, from the anchovy invasion to the grease trap to the quarantine episode, there is no point where any character proposes a systemic solution. Nobody suggests sealing the building more effectively against marine life. Nobody proposes a regular pest inspection schedule. Nobody connects one infestation event to another and asks whether there might be a common underlying cause worth addressing. Each incident is treated, every time, as its own isolated emergency, to be resolved through whatever immediate action the plot of that particular episode calls for, and then forgotten entirely once the episode ends. This is, in some ways, the most concerning pattern of all, more concerning than any single incident on its own. A restaurant that experiences one major pest or contamination event might simply have had bad luck. A restaurant that experiences these events repeatedly, across multiple episodes and multiple forms, structural damage from anchovies, fungal outbreak, toxic health contamination, an illness outbreak that turns out to be caused by the building's own unclean surfaces, and never once addresses the underlying vulnerability that makes all of these events possible, is not experiencing bad luck. It is operating according to a structure that guarantees these events will keep happening, because nothing about the conditions that allow them has ever changed. There is a way of thinking about this that connects back to the very beginning of this video. The Krusty Krab was built on top of a retirement home, repurposed without the kind of design considerations a purpose-built restaurant would have. It sits in an underwater environment with no clear barrier against marine life. Its grease trap goes unmaintained for long enough that emptying it requires industrial equipment. Its freezer has been used, at various points, as a hiding place for an unconscious body and as a proposed containment cell for a sick person. None of these are separate problems with separate causes. They are all symptoms of the same underlying reality, a building that was never properly adapted for the function it now serves, operating under ownership that has never shown any interest in addressing root causes rather than immediate symptoms. When you look at the pattern this way, across years of episodes rather than within any single one, the question stops being, why did this particular infestation or contamination happen in this particular episode, and becomes, why would anyone expect it not to happen, given everything that remains true about this building between every single episode that has ever aired. The anchovies got in once because the building was vulnerable. The fungal and contamination issues spread because nothing about how ingredients are sourced or stored has ever been shown to meet any kind of standard. The illness in the quarantine episode turned out to be caused by the building's own surfaces because those surfaces have never been properly cleaned. Each of these, examined individually, looks like an isolated story. Examined together, they look like the predictable output of a single set of unchanged conditions, repeating themselves in slightly different forms, episode after episode, year after year. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Looking at infestations as a pattern across the years shows a building that was never going to stop having these problems. The next section turns to the people who have had to work inside that building every day and what the show reveals about how little protection they have ever actually had. Section 8. The employees who were never protected. A restaurant is not just a structure and a menu. It is also a workplace, and the people who work there are exposed to every single thing covered in this video in a way that customers who come and go are not. SpongeBob and Squidward are inside this building for the full length of every shift, every day, regardless of what is happening with the grease trap, the freezer, the pests, or whatever Mr. Krabs happens to be cooking that evening. This section is about them, and about what the show reveals, often without framing it as a big deal, regarding how little protection either of them has ever actually had. The starting point for this is something that has already come up earlier in this video, but deserves to be looked at on its own terms now. According to source material describing the broader history of the Krusty Krab, Mr. Krabs has, across the show's run, been shown to violate what is described as many workers' rights laws, to the point where the source material describes the working conditions at points as being almost like slave labor. This is not a description this video is applying after the fact. It is language drawn directly from how the show's own history has been documented, and once you start looking for the specific examples that back this description up, they are not hard to find. Pay is one of the clearest examples. According to source material, the amount SpongeBob has been shown to receive for his work has varied across episodes, but in at least one instance, his payment for an entire shift consisted of of an envelope containing money, with no further detail given about what that amount actually represented relative to the work performed. Squidward, in another episode, mentions that he is paid at minimum wage, which on its own might not sound unusual, except that this comment is made in the context of an episode where Squidward is going through significant physical and emotional hardship, and the minimum wage detail is presented less as a neutral fact and more as part of a larger picture of an employee who is underpaid relative to what the job actually demands of him. There is also a detail from an episode called Bossy Boots that is worth pulling out here because it touches on something that connects directly back to the food safety concerns covered earlier in this video. According to source material, Bossy Boots is the first episode in which the Krusty Krab's grill is removed from the kitchen entirely, as part of Pearl's attempt to retheme the restaurant during her time working there. The grill is the primary piece of equipment SpongeBob uses to prepare the Krabby Patties that are the restaurant's signature product. The fact that an episode exists in which this piece of equipment is simply removed, even temporarily, as part of an internal management change, says something about how replaceable and how little protected the actual food preparation process is considered to be by the people making decisions about the restaurant. The grill is not treated as a fixed, essential piece of safety-critical equipment. It is treated as a piece of furniture that can be swapped out based on whatever theme the restaurant happens to be pursuing that week. Beyond pay and equipment, there is the matter of physical safety, and here the pattern becomes harder to look past. According to source material describing the broader history of the Krusty Krab, Mr. Krabs has been shown, across multiple episodes, to physically abuse his workers, with Squidward specifically named as the primary target of this treatment. One specific example given is an episode called The Krusty Sponge, in which Mr. Krabs has Squidward give a judge a ride on what is described as a train, except that this train is pedal-powered, meaning Squidward himself is providing the physical labor to move it while at the same time being whipped, in the source material's words, like cattle. It is worth slowing down on this example specifically, because of what it represents when placed in context. This is not an incident that happens because of a malfunctioning piece of kitchen equipment, or because of a pest infestation, or because of contaminated food. This is Mr. Krabs directing physical punishment toward an employee, using language and imagery, being whipped like cattle, that the source material itself uses without softening. And the context for this incident, according to the broader description of the Krusty Sponge, is that Mr. Krabs has gotten into legal trouble, having been arrested at one point in that episode's events for serving poisoned food to the town. The employee being whipped while pedaling a judge around is happening in the context of Mr. Krabs trying to manage the fallout from yet another food safety failure, one severe enough to result in his arrest. This connects two threads of this video together in a way that is worth being explicit about. The food safety failures covered throughout this video are not separate from the labor conditions covered in this section. They are connected. When something goes wrong with the food, when an inspector arrives, when the restaurant faces consequences, it is not Mr. Krabs who bears the brunt of dealing with the fallout in any meaningful sense. It is the employees. Squidward ends up providing physical labor while being abused in the aftermath of a food safety incident that was Mr. Krabs' doing in the first place. The pattern that has run through every section of this video, where Mr. Krabs makes a decision driven by money, something goes wrong, and someone else ends up dealing with the consequences, is not limited to customers or to inspectors. It extends directly to the people who work there every day. There is another example worth covering here, drawn from an episode called Squidward in Clarinet Land. According to source material, in this episode, Mr. Krabs refuses to provide Squidward with any storage space for his clarinet. On its surface, this might sound like a minor workplace grievance, the kind of small indignity that exists in any job, but place it in the context of everything else covered in this video regarding how space inside the Krusty Krab is allocated. This is a building where the freezer, meant for food storage, has been used to hide an unconscious body and proposed as a quarantine cell for a sick person. This is a building with an unmaintained grease trap taking up space underneath the structure. This is a building where, in at least one episode, the grill itself was removed entirely as part of a redecoration. And yet, within this same building, there is apparently no space that can be made available for an employee to store a personal item related to something he cares about. The building space is treated as endlessly flexible when it comes to whatever Mr. Krabs' current priorities are, and completely inflexible when it comes to the basic needs of the person working there. Source material also points to instances where employees and customers alike have been kept captive inside the Krusty Krab, citing episodes including Fear of a Krabby Patty and Chum Caverns as examples. While the specific plots of these episodes were not part of the research gathered for this video, the framing in the source material is direct, describing these as instances where Mr. Krabs has kept people inside the restaurant against their will. Combined with the labor conditions, the physical treatment described in the Krusty Sponge, and the pay conditions described in episodes like Squid on Strike and Bummer Vacation, a picture starts to form of a workplace where an employee's ability to simply leave, to remove themselves from whatever hazardous situation is currently unfolding inside the restaurant, cannot always be taken for granted. This matters enormously when you place it alongside the food safety incidents covered earlier in this video. In the Nasty Patty episode, SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs together carried out a deliberate act of food contamination. In the Quarantined Crab episode, the characters inside the restaurant were placed under quarantine, unable to leave, while the building's own conditions made them sick. In Greasy Buffoons, SpongeBob was the one who ultimately had to physically absorb an entire grease spill into his own body in order to resolve the crisis, with no indication of additional compensation for this. In each case, it is SpongeBob, and to a lesser extent Squidward, who bear the direct physical consequences of decisions that were made by Mr. Krabs, or that arose from conditions inside a building Mr. Krabs owns and has never meaningfully improved. There is a specific kind of vulnerability that comes from being an employee in a workplace like this, one that is worth naming directly. A customer who eats a bad Krabby Patty experiences that as a single bad meal, an isolated incident. An inspector who visits the restaurant experiences it as a single inspection, one encounter with whatever conditions happen to be present that day. But SpongeBob and Squidward experience all of it, every day, as the ongoing condition of their employment. The grease trap that took industrial equipment to empty was something they were working around every single day before that episode, and presumably continued working around afterward, since no episode shows it being placed on any kind of maintenance schedule going forward. The freezer that has been used to hide bodies and was proposed as a quarantine cell is the same freezer they use to store food for the patties they serve every single shift. The kitchen that produced a living appetizer creature in Squilliam Returns is the kitchen SpongeBob works in every single day. Under normal circumstances, when Mr. Krabs is not the one cooking. What this section adds to the overall picture this video has been building is a recognition that every violation covered so far has a human cost that extends beyond the single episode it appears in. These are not problems that get resolved and then go away for the employees who have to keep coming back to work the next day. The conditions remain. The grease trap remains underneath the building. The freezer remains available for whatever purpose Mr. Krabs decides it should serve next. The pay remains whatever Mr. Krabs decides it should be, with no indication across any of the source material that any kind of formal wage structure beyond Mr. Krabs' own preferences exists at all. And the physical risk demonstrated explicitly in the Krusty Sponge, where an employee was whipped while providing physical labor as part of managing the fallout from Mr. Krabs' own legal troubles, remains a possibility that has already happened at least once, and that nothing in the show's history suggests has been addressed or prevented from happening again. By the time you reach this point in the video, having gone through structural damage, deliberate contamination, equipment failure, an outbreak, a town-wide toxic contamination event, and a kitchen that produces living monsters, it becomes clear that the people who have been present for every single one of these events, the people who have had the least ability to simply walk away from any of it, are the two employees who show up to work at this restaurant every day. SpongeBob and Squidward are not bystanders to the history this video has been documenting. They are, in many ways, its primary witnesses and its primary casualties, present for every incident, protected from none of them, and show no indication across the show's history that any of it has ever been addressed in a way that would prevent the next one from happening to them as well. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Looking at the employees who have lived through every one of these incidents shows just how little protection has ever existed inside this restaurant. The next section steps back even further to look at how inspections themselves have functioned across all of these episodes, and what it reveals when you compare every single one of them side by side. Section 9. The inspections that should have shut it down. For good health inspectors and other figures of authority have appeared again and again across this video, each arriving for a different reason, each encountering a different version of whatever happens to be wrong inside the Krusty Krab that day. Until now, each visit has been examined inside the episode it belongs to. This section does something different. It lines every inspection and every legal proceeding up side by side and stops treating them as isolated visits, looking instead at what they become when read as a single, ongoing relationship between this restaurant and the people whose job it is to oversee it. The first inspection covered in this video was the Nasty Patty episode. A legitimate health inspector arrived for what the episode itself describes as a surprise inspection. He was given food prepared specifically for him, sampled across the entire menu, and at the point where he requested one final item before passing judgment, he was instead served a deliberately contaminated patty made with hot sauce, toenail clippings, and material that had been submerged in a toilet and dried with a gym sock. He was then, as a direct result of this contaminated food and the panic that followed, knocked unconscious multiple times, dragged across town, hidden inside a police vehicle, hidden inside a hat, and stored inside the restaurant's freezer, all because the two people responsible for the kitchen believed, incorrectly, that he was an imposter. The second inspection covered in this video was the one in Greasy Buffoons. This inspector arrived wearing full protective gear, goggles, and a breathing mask, equipment that the source material connects to other quarantine suits seen seen elsewhere in the show, suggesting this level of protection was something inspectors in this world had needed before. This inspector discovered that 2 competing restaurants had been knowingly serving reclaimed waste grease to the public as a menu item, and his response was to order both establishments closed until the situation was corrected. The third inspection, in Quarantined Krab, did not involve food at all. This inspector arrived using some kind of detection device, declared that an illness was present inside the restaurant, and placed the entire building under quarantine, locking everyone inside. When that quarantine turned out to be based on a false reading, the same inspector returned later, found that the characters had become genuinely ill in the meantime due to the building's own conditions, and placed the restaurant under quarantine again, this time for something real. There is a fourth case worth adding to this comparison now, because it is, in some ways, the most serious of all of them, and it did not come from a health inspector at all. It came from the entire town, acting together, in an episode called The Krusty Sponge. According to source material, this episode begins with a food critic visiting the Krusty Krab and praising SpongeBob's cooking while criticizing everything else about the restaurant. Mr. Krabs, seeing an opportunity in this praise, decides to rebrand the entire restaurant around SpongeBob's image, transforming it into a themed establishment called the Krusty Sponge, complete with merchandise lines including drinking straws, coasters, bibs, ice cubes, and a ride built around the building called the Fun Train. As part of this rebranding, Mr. Krabs introduces a new menu item called the Spongy Patty, described in source material as a tainted Krabby Patty made to visually resemble SpongeBob. According to source material, these patties were, in effect, expired or moldy Krabby Patties that had simply been repackaged and rebranded to fit the new theme, rather than thrown out as they should have been. Customers across the restaurant eat these spongy patties, and the result, according to source material, is that everyone who consumes one turns yellow with olive green spots and develops severe stomach pain. What happens next is the most direct legal consequence to appear anywhere in this video. SpongeBob, returning to the restaurant and seeing what has happened, directly accuses Mr. Krabs of poisoning every customer inside. According to the transcript referenced in source material, SpongeBob's exact words to Mr. Krabs are that he has poisoned all of these people, which means he is killing them. Mr. Krabs is immediately arrested, not by an inspector this time, but by a police officer who had been posing as a customer, and the case proceeds directly to court. The case is described in source material as the entire community of Bikini Bottom versus Mr. Krabs. A jury, made up of the poisoned customers themselves, all still visibly yellow with green spots, finds Mr. Krabs guilty on all charges. The judge asks Mr. Krabs if he has anything to say before being sent to prison, and Mr. Krabs says no. This is, by any measure, the closest this video gets to an actual consequence landing. A criminal trial, a guilty verdict on all charges, delivered by a jury made up of Mr. Krabs' own poisoned customers. A judge prepared to send him to prison. And then, according to source material, the entire outcome is reversed in the span of a single detail. The judge happens to own a SpongeBob branded gavel and turns out to be a fan of SpongeBob. Mr. Krabs notices this and proposes a deal on the spot, an arrangement in which SpongeBob returns to cooking normally and Squidward personally drives the judge around the restaurant on the Fun Train for the rest of the day. The judge accepts this deal. The guilty verdict, the poisoning of an entire restaurant full of customers, the prison sentence that was moments away from being handed down, all of it is set aside, not through an appeal, not through any review of evidence, but through a personal favor exchanged directly between the man who was just convicted and the man who was about to sentence him. Now place all 4 of these side by side. In the first, the inspector was the target of a deliberate criminal act of food contamination, and the restaurant's response to the belief that he had died was an attempted cover-up involving a buried body. In the second, the inspector discovered an active scheme involving 2 restaurants serving toxic reclaimed waste to an entire town and ordered both closed. In the third, the inspector found a real, building-caused illness on his second visit, after his first visit had already triggered a quarantine for a threat that did not exist. And in the fourth, an entire jury of poisoned customers found Mr. Krabs guilty of poisoning them, a judge was prepared to imprison him, and the sentence was traded away for a ride on an amusement attraction. What ties all 4 of these together is not just that they all happened at the same restaurant, it is what happens after each one. In the Nasty Patty episode, once the truth comes out and the inspector is revealed to be alive and legitimate, the episode simply ends. There is no scene of him completing his inspection, no scene of him reporting what happened to him, no scene of any consequence being applied to Mr. Krabs or SpongeBob for what they did to him, even though what they did would in any real context represent one of the most serious things a restaurant owner could possibly do to a government official performing his duties. In Greasy Buffoons, the closure order issued by the inspector is, on paper, one of the most serious documented consequences in this entire video. 2 restaurants ordered shut simultaneously for knowingly serving contaminated product to the public, and yet, as covered earlier in this video, the actual resolution involves neither owner doing any of the required cleanup themselves. themselves. SpongeBob absorbs the grease into his own body and disposes of it alone, and the episode ends with Mr. Krabs waking up the next day to find the mess gone, initially assuming it was all a dream. There is no reinspection shown. There is no scene confirming the grease trap itself, the original source of the entire crisis, has been repaired or placed on any kind of maintenance schedule. In Quarantine Krab, the second quarantine, the one based on a real illness rather than a false one, is the last thing that happens in the episode. There is no scene showing how that quarantine resolves, how long it lasts, or what changes inside the restaurant as a result of an inspector discovering that the building itself was capable of making multiple people sick through nothing more than direct contact with its own surfaces. And in the Krusty Sponge, the episode that comes closest to an actual conviction, with an entire jury and a judge's verdict, the resolution is not a sentence served, a fine paid, or even a public acknowledgement from Mr. Krabs of what he did. It is a ride on a train. According to source material, the restaurant is converted back to its normal form, the merchandise line presumably discontinued, and the episode moves on, with no indication that Mr. Krabs faces any lasting record, any follow-up investigation into a restaurant whose owner has now been formally found guilty by his own customers of poisoning them, or any change to how the kitchen operates going forward. When you put all four of these side by side, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Every single one of these proceedings, whether an inspection or a full criminal trial, uncovers something serious. Attempted murder of a public official, disguised as an accident, followed by an attempted cover-up. A coordinated scheme to serve toxic waste to an entire town. A building whose interior surfaces are themselves capable of causing illness severe enough to warrant quarantine. And a guilty verdict delivered by a jury of poisoned victims for knowingly serving expired and contaminated food to an entire restaurant full of people. By the standard of any real regulatory or legal system, any one of these four outcomes alone would represent grounds for permanent closure, criminal investigation, imprisonment, or all three. And yet in every single case, the episode ends before any of that can actually happen. The restaurant always reopens. The next episode always begins with the Krusty Krab serving customers again, as though none of this happened, with no acknowledgement that an inspector was nearly killed, that a closure order was issued, that the building itself was just formally identified as a source of illness, or that its owner was convicted by his own customers of poisoning them. This is, in a sense, the inspection and legal system working exactly as often as it needs to, and exactly as ineffectively as it always has. Inspectors and juries do arrive, and they do find things. They are not, within these episodes, portrayed as corrupt, incompetent, or unwilling to act. The inspector in Greasy Buffoons issues a closure order the moment he understands what is happening. The inspector in Quarantine Krab returns a second time and takes the new illness seriously. The jury in the Krusty Sponge convicts Mr. Krabs without hesitation, despite being made up of his own customers. The failure is not on the side of the people doing the inspecting, the judging, or the convicting. The failure is that whatever happens after, whatever order is issued, whatever verdict is reached, simply does not carry forward into the next episode. Each proceeding exists in its own sealed moment, with its own consequences contained entirely within the episode it appears in, and then the slate is wiped clean, every time, without exception. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Looking at every inspection and legal proceeding side by side shows a system that finds real problems every single time and never once makes them stick. The final section brings everything in this video together to ask what all of this adds up to and why this restaurant has never actually been shut down for good. Section 10. Why the Krusty Krab stayed open anyway. At this point, it is worth holding all of it in your mind at once, because no single incident on its own captures what this restaurant actually is. A building that was never designed to be a restaurant, taking structural damage from a pest invasion in the very first episode. An owner and a fry cook deliberately building a contaminated patty to punish a man they wrongly believed had wronged them. A grease trap so neglected that draining it required industrial equipment. An entire town drinking a beverage later classified as toxic waste. A kitchen that produced food that came alive. Pest events that recur with no systemic response. Labor conditions the show's own surrounding material calls close to slave labor. And an inspection record in which every serious finding stops mattering the moment the credits roll. This is what the Krusty Krab has been the whole time, underneath its reputation as the most beloved restaurant in Bikini Bottom. Taken individually, each of these is a story about a single bad day at a single restaurant. Taken together, they describe something closer to a structural condition, a set of circumstances that does not change from episode to episode because nothing about the underlying foundation of the restaurant ever changes. And once you see it this way, the question this video has been circling since the very first section becomes unavoidable. Why does this restaurant stay open? Not why did it survive any one of these incidents specifically, but why, after all of them, after a decades-long decontamination event, after a closure order issued against it, after an inspector was nearly killed inside it, does the Krusty Krab remain, episode after episode, food, the most popular restaurant in Bikini Bottom, with customers lined up at the counter as though none of this history exists. The first part of the answer has to do with something this video touched on early but is worth returning to now with the full picture in view. The Krusty Krab's food is good, not safe, not properly handled, not prepared under conditions that would pass any real inspection, but good, in the sense that the people of Bikini Bottom genuinely want to eat it. Source material describing the broader history of the Krusty Krab notes that the restaurant's success relative to the chum bucket comes down primarily to the quality of its food. This is not a small detail. It means that whatever else is true about this building, the actual product, the Krabby Patty itself, works. People want it, they keep coming back for it, and that desire is strong enough that it appears to override every single thing this video has documented. The grease trap crisis did not stop people from eating there. The quarantine did not stop people from eating there once it lifted. Even the toxic kelp shake situation, which affected the entire town, did not appear to create any lasting hesitation about what people were willing to put into their bodies at restaurants in Bikini Bottom going forward. This points to something about how food safety functions, or fails to function, when the underlying product is desirable enough. A restaurant with food nobody wanted would not survive a single one of these incidents. It would not need to, because it would already be empty. The Krusty Krab survives every incident covered in this video, specifically because the thing it is selling is good enough that people are willing to overlook, forget, or simply never learn about everything else. This is not a flattering conclusion, but it is the one the evidence points toward. The quality of the Krabby Patty functions as a kind of shield, not because anyone is actively choosing to look past the restaurant's history, but because most people, both inside the show and watching it, never connect any of these individual episodes into the pattern this video has spent the last hour and a half building. The second part of the answer has to do with something that runs through every single section of this video, and it is the character of Mr. Krabs himself. Every decision that created or escalated a violation in this video traces back to the same root motivation: money. Mr. Krabs' reaction to the health inspector in Nasty Patty was driven by his fury at the idea of having given away free food. His decision to dump waste grease near the chum bucket was driven by a grudge tied to lost business. His agreement to let Squidward transform the restaurant for Squilliam was driven by Squilliam's wealth. His reaction to losing customers to the Kelp Shake restaurant was an outright ban rather than any investigation into what the product actually was. Even the labor conditions covered in an earlier section, the pay described as an envelope of money, the minimum wage Squidward receives despite everything the job involved, the refusal to provide storage space for Squidward's clarinet, all of it comes back to the same source. Every dollar spent on anything other than the absolute minimum required to keep the doors open is, in Mr. Krabs' framework, a dollar lost. What this means, in practice, is that the Krusty Krab does not operate according to any internal standard for food safety, employee treatment, or building maintenance. It operates according to a single question, asked over and over, in every episode, under every circumstance. Does this cost money, and can it be avoided? The grease trap was emptied only when the alternative was a lawsuit. The fine dining transformation for Squilliam happened because Squilliam's money made it worthwhile. The Kelp Shake ban happened because Mr. Krabs was losing money to a competitor. At no point across any of these episodes does Mr. Krabs make a decision because it is the right thing to do for the building, the food, the employees, or the customers, independent of what it costs or what it earns. And because every decision flows from this single filter, the actual condition of the restaurant, its grease trap, its freezer, its kitchen, its pest vulnerability, its labor practices, never improves in any lasting way. It only ever gets addressed at the exact moment the cost of not addressing it becomes unavoidable, and the moment that cost passes, the underlying condition reverts to exactly what it was before. This connects to the third part of the answer, which is the one this video has been building toward without stating it directly until now. The Krusty Krab does not stay open because it passes inspections, or because its violations get fixed, or because anyone in a position of authority decides the restaurant deserves to remain in business despite everything documented in this video. The Krusty Krab stays open because, within the world of the show, every single incident is treated as a closed loop. It begins, it escalates, it resolves, and then it ends completely, with no connection drawn to anything that came before it or anything that will come after it. The inspector in Nasty Patty is never mentioned again. The grease trap closure in Greasy Buffoons is never referenced in any later episode as something that affected how the restaurant operates going forward. The illness from Quarantine Krab does not appear to leave any of the characters with lasting effects by the time the next episode begins. Each episode is, structurally, a reset. Whatever happened last time did not happen this time, as far as the world of the show is concerned. This is, in many ways, simply how episodic television of this kind works, and it would be unfair to treat it as though the show is making some kind of pointed statement by structuring itself this way. But it is worth noticing what this structure produces when you apply it to a restaurant specifically, a place whose entire premise depends on consistency, on the idea that what you ate there last time tells you something reliable about what you will get this time. The episodic episodic reset that makes the show work as entertainment is the exact same mechanism that allows the Krusty Krab to exist as a functioning restaurant despite a documented history that, if it were ever allowed to accumulate the way it would in reality, would make its continued operation completely impossible to justify. There is a version of this video that could have been made differently, one that simply listed these 10 incidents as a kind of comedy reel. Look how absurd this restaurant is. Look at all the ridiculous things that have happened there. And on one level, that is exactly what this is. These are comedic episodes from a children's animated show, and the events covered in this video are, within their original context, jokes. The buried body in Nasty Patty is a slapstick sequence. The appetizer creature in Squilliam Returns is a punchline. The kelp shake contamination is an absurdist escalation, two rivals competing over who can drink more of an unidentified substance. None of this was written with the intention of being examined the way this video has examined it. But there is a reason that lining all of this up, even from a comedic source, produces something that feels different from comedy once you see it as a whole. It is because the individual jokes all rely on a shared assumption that the audience, watching each episode in isolation, never has reason to question. The assumption is that whatever just happened does not matter going forward. The buried body does not matter, because next episode the inspector is gone and never thought about again. The grease trap does not matter, because next episode nobody mentions it. The appetizer creature does not matter, because next episode the kitchen is back to normal. Whatever normal means in this kitchen. Each joke works precisely because it is contained, because the show trusts its audience not to ask what any of this means for the restaurant tomorrow. This video has spent an hour and a half doing exactly the thing the show's structure depends on nobody doing, which is asking what all of this means for the restaurant tomorrow, and then tomorrow, and then tomorrow after that, across years of episodes. And what emerges from that question is not really a story about one restaurant's bad luck, or even about one owner's greed, although both of those things are certainly part of it. What emerges is closer to a portrait of how a place can develop a reputation, a routine, an entire identity built around being a beloved local institution, while carrying inside it a history that, if anyone ever sat down and actually accounted for all of it the way this video has, would be almost impossible to reconcile with that reputation. The Krusty Krab is the most popular restaurant in Bikini Bottom. That fact is stated and restated throughout the show's history, treated as simply true, the same way the show treats the quality of the Krabby Patty as simply true. And everything covered in this video is also true, within the same show, existing in the same continuity, attached to the same building, the same owner, the same employees. The show never asks these two truths to coexist in the same scene. The popularity exists in most episodes. The violations exist in a handful of specific episodes. They are never placed side by side because the show's format does not require them to be, and because doing so would undermine the comedic premise that makes each individual incident work as a joke in the first place. What this video has done, by placing them side by side anyway, is not an attempt to argue that SpongeBob SquarePants is secretly dark, or that there is some hidden message buried in these episodes that the creators intended all along. That would be its own kind of overreach, reading intention into a structure that exists primarily because episodic comedy works this way, full stop. What this video has tried to do instead is simpler than that. It has tried to take something that exists in the show, scattered across years and dozens of episodes, never connected, never accumulated, and ask what it looks like once it is connected and accumulated, purely as an exercise in paying attention to what is actually there. And what is actually there, when you do that, is a restaurant with a documented history of structural failure, deliberate food contamination targeting a government inspector, equipment failure severe enough to require industrial remediation, a town-wide toxic contamination event, a kitchen capable of producing food that becomes a hostile living creature, recurring pest and contamination incidents with no systemic response, labor conditions described in its own surrounding material as close to slave labor, and an inspection record in which every single finding, no matter how serious, simply stops mattering the moment the credits roll. None of this changes what the Krusty Krab is to the characters who eat there, or to the audience who has watched this show for years. The Krabby Patty is still, within the logic of the show, the best thing in Bikini Bottom. SpongeBob is still, despite everything documented in this video about the conditions he works in, someone who loves his job, genuinely and completely, in a way that the show never frames as anything other than sincere. Squidward is still there too, every single day, despite the pay, despite the abuse described in the Krusty Sponge, despite the missing storage space for his clarinet, because for Squidward, as for so many people in real workplaces, leaving is not as simple as it sounds, and the job, whatever its conditions, is still the job. And Mr. Krabs is still there, behind the register or counting his money in the back, having survived every single one of these incidents without ever once being the one who pays the real cost of any of them. The inspector who was nearly killed in Nasty Patty pays the cost. The town that drank the kelp shake pays the cost. SpongeBob, absorbing an entire grease spill into his own body with no extra pay, pays the cost. Squidward, peddling a train while being whipped in the aftermath of Mr. Krabs' own arrest pays the cost. Mr. Krabs' cost across every single episode covered in this video is temporary inconvenience, quickly forgotten on the way back to counting his money. This is why the Krusty Krab stayed open. Not because it passed inspections, and not because its violations were ever actually resolved, but because the cost of every single one of them was always paid by someone other than the person who owned the building, and because the show's own structure ensures that none of those costs ever carry forward into the next episode to be added up. 10 incidents examined individually are 10 jokes. 10 incidents examined together are a history, and the Krusty Krab has spent its entire existence being allowed to have one without ever having to acknowledge the other.
If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.